Now, if you want honest insights, genuine lessons, and maybe even some inspiration from someone that's truly been there, and I know that's why you listen to my show, but stick around, guy. Stick around, please, because I promise this conversation is going to give you some real value.
So when I went through the transformation process, I really had to discover what was important to me. And because, the curse was I achieved my success very early, 29 years old, making six figures and taking off like a rocket ship.
Welcome, entrepreneur movers and shakers. This is the Tony DUrso Show. You're at the right place. Welcome back to the podcast. Now listen, we both know being an entrepreneur isn't easy. It comes with stress, tough decisions, and even tougher questions. Sometimes all we really need is to hear from someone who's genuinely walked that road and made it through successfully. And that's exactly why I invited Stroum on the show today. Now, we had him on a few years ago for a short insider's brief, and I knew we needed to get him back on again. He's the founder of Venmark International. It's a company that reshapes how new and innovative products reach their markets. It's really cool stuff. He's navigated the twists and turns of entrepreneurship. He's built his business. He's hired family, and he's written about the deeper lessons that he learned along the way in his book, which we're going to talk about, called Success and Self-Discovery. Now, if you want honest insights, genuine lessons, and maybe even some inspiration from someone that's truly been there, and I know that's why you listen to my show, but stick around, guy. Stick around, please, because I promise this conversation is going to give you some real value and practical guidance to help you along your own entrepreneurial journey. Let's jump in. Let's go do this. Hi, Steve. Welcome to the Tony DUrso Show.
Thank you, Tony. It's great to be with you. It's good to see you.
Thank you. It's so much fun. When we chatted just before we got on, it was just like old times. I really enjoyed that insider's brief that we did a couple of years ago. And for anyone that hasn't heard it yet, just go check it out. Go to my podcast page and type in STROUM, and you should be able to find that, as well as other podcast places, but I've got a cool search feature on my page. And So now we want to do an really expanded, because we want to talk about, I want to know, as well as the audience, we want to talk about navigating entrepreneurial success. And as we have some new people, let's talk about your backstory a little bit, Steve. Before we dive into the entrepreneurial wisdom, can you tell us a bit about your journey? How did you become the entrepreneur that you are today?
Well, it really started when I grew up in a blue collar family, and it was always, we had one uncle who was on the West Coast, and he had become very successful, and he used to come back and visit because he was a manufacturer's rep, and he had companies back here he called on. And he used to come, and I remember being 6 years old and seeing him standing. His name is Sam Stroum. Seeing Uncle Sam stand there, and he had these black alligator shoes up, and his foot was on a step ladder. And I looked up at him, and it was just, man, I want to be like him someday. But like most blue collar kids, I never had a clue of how you went about doing it, And at any rate, long story short, when I ended up going to college, I went to college briefly, Northeastern University, quit, went in the Air Force, ended up getting a medical discharge, came back to school, went back to college. In my freshman year, I worked hard. I got B's and C's, and that was my label as a kid. I had two older brothers, both smarter than me growing up. They were curriculum 1 in school. I was curriculum 2. I had a label. My label was, Steve works really hard, nobody wanted to continue it and say, but he's not too bright. So at any rate, in my sophomore year of college, I went into the Boston campus at Northeastern, and there was a kid in my class named Dave Whitney. Dave got straight A's, straight A student, and I broke my butt and I got B's and C's. So one day I said to him, Dave, with all due respect, my friend, you don't seem to be that much smarter than me. You don't, but you're getting straight A's and I'm only getting B's and C's. What's up with that? And he looked at me and said, Steve, I'll tell you, I am a lot smarter than you, and here's why. He said, I have a process that I follow, an academic study process. And what I do is I make sure I have syllabus from every one of my professors. And if they don't give me a syllabus for the entire trimester, I insist upon it verbally. And then I sit down and I plan out my entire semester, every hour of every day. So I'm just reviewing when you guys are studying and cramming. That's why I'm much smarter than you. So, Tony, from that moment on, I implemented this study plan. And from that moment on, I got straight A's my last 4 years of college. So what changed? The process changed. And the process gave me a sense of security. Now naturally I went through all the nonsense you go through. All of a sudden it's very difficult to go from being he tries hard and then too bright to holy shit, he's a whiz. So you have to make personal adjustments and everything else. And nobody likes a winner, boy. People treat you differently when you get straight A's. It's okay to get B's and C's because they feel okay. When you get straight A's, it's a different story. So that's the backstory. That's how I learned the respect for process.
Totally, totally. I'm just nodding my head, tracking with you. I did 5 years, college, university. I graduated summa cum laude. I had my process. It was work. It was really work. It's like if you want it, you really got to go for it and you got to plan it out, which we're going to talk about later. We're going to talk about that in your book. There's no, I know there's an expression of just being, half-hearted about something. It's like, I believe when you want to do something, you just really got to put yourself into it and do it. Otherwise, why bother?
Exactly. You have to be assertive. And, I learned that with one of my co-op jobs at Northeastern University. And I had a fabulous program, cooperative education. You work for 6 months, go to school for 6, work for 3, go to school for 3. Well, I had an opportunity to get, in the insurance business. And I worked in the home office as a claim examiner, which was the most boring thing I ever did in my life. Piece of paper here, another one there, and it was crazy. And in that experience as a claim examiner, people in the back room spent the entire day, my colleagues spent the entire day reading the Boston Globe. I mean, they didn't do anything. So I didn't feel good about that. That was a corporate experience that just didn't make me feel very good. And so when they invited me back for another term, I said, no, I'm not interested. I love the company, but I need to be in sales. And they said, well, we've never put a co-op student in sales before. I said, you've never met a co-op student like me. I've been in the service. I'm married. I'm as old as any entry level employee. I'd love to have the opportunity. So they sent me out to Boston. I met with the brokerage manager and I met with the group sales manager. And these guys both wanted me. Now, not necessarily because I was great, although I thought I was, but they could get a free employee on the home office's budget. So naturally they took a free. So I had the opportunity to go in the brokerage office and just supposed to do support work and whatever that meant. And I was there for 2 weeks. I went out with a couple of guys in the field making sales calls. And I went back to my boss and I said, Ken, I can do this better than they can. I'd love the opportunity to get a license and go out and sell. He said, Steve, we've never done that before. I said, Ken, you've never had anybody like me before. So long story short, I got within 3 weeks, I had my insurance licenses and stock licenses. And I ended up leading my office in sales in my senior year when I was working part-time as a co-op student and studying full-time. So I led the office in sales and they invited my wife and I on different trips. And so I learned about asserting. So the other thing, when I graduated college, I was in a position to negotiate my full-time salary with 5 weeks paid vacation in advance. People say to me, how'd you get that? I said, I asked for it.
It's amazing.
All they could do is say no.
Exactly.
So that's entrepreneurial behavior. You assess the risk. You assess the risk and that worked for me when I was in the Air Force as well. I was a munitions specialist in the middle of the Vietnam War. And I was at Lowry Air Force Base Tech School. I befriended the sergeant who gave out assignments. And at that time, my older brother was stationed in Thailand. So I said, listen, if you have anything coming up in Thailand, I'd love the opportunity to go be stationed there. So the guy said, yeah, well, you know what happened? They only had one position in Thailand. Everybody else in my squad, they called it a flight. Everybody in my flight went to Pensacola Air Force Base for jungle training in Vietnam. I went to Thailand. Okay. Why? Because I asked for it and I set it up. So that's the kind of thing that entrepreneurs are all about. It's making things happen.
Yeah, exactly. I like to kind of fast forward now and go into starting Venmark, which is quite a great story in itself. What inspired you to create Venmark International? And also, what problem were you really trying to solve with it?
Okay. Well, interestingly enough, my wife and I moved out to San Francisco in 1974. And it was another situation where a buddy of mine said, if you don't go now, you'll regret it. You'll never do it. So we moved out to San Francisco, and I ended up getting a job with Fireman's Fund American Life Insurance Company as a life sales representative in their Walnut Creek office. And the position, it was a wholesale position, basically a B2B type situation, business to business type, where I was calling on the company's property and casualty agents, convincing them to sell life insurance. Well, long story short, I took over sales territory, 49th out of 50th in the country. And within 3 months, took it to third place in the country. So my boss called me into his office, and I figured, this is great. I'm going to get, maybe I'll get a raise. So I go into his office and he says to me, Steve, in life, some people need steak to be happy and other people are satisfied with pork and beans. He said, around here, pork and beans are just fine. Do you understand what I mean?
Ouch.
Naturally, I was totally deflated, absolutely deflated. And I remember driving back into San Francisco. I don't know if you've ever been out there through the Caldecott Tunnel, and you'll see the entire span of the Bay Area. And I was angry. Here I was excelling, and I had my sales manager tell me to slow down because they don't want to work that hard. So what did I do? With guilt, I took the next 5 weeks off. I went down I made a couple of phone calls. I went to the Marina Green and I jogged around, but I didn't really work. So I'm in the home office for a meeting. Again, 5 weeks later, the VP in charge of brokerage comes up to me and he puts his arm on my shoulder and said, congratulations. I said, for what? He said, you're leading the company in sales. I said, shame on you. I'm leading your company in sales. Look at my tan. I haven't worked in 5 weeks. So he said, come on into my office. Obviously talking like that, I didn't, I didn't care if I got the boot. So anyway, I went into his office and he said, what do you want to do? And I told him the story and he says, well, I said, I'd like to write your national sales training program. You people really have no clue what you're doing. And he said to me, well, what if I don't? I said, then I'll go to Safeco, their largest competitor. Now, here I was 25 years old. I'm talking like this, right? But I didn't care. So anyway, I got in, I wrote the national sales training program. In 1975, I'll never forget, it was September. I go to Silverado Country Club to give this presentation. And I'm walking up to the rostrum and I see Johnny Bench, Cincinnati Reds. He's playing catcher. The Red Sox are in the World Series. I'll never forget that. Well, I get up to the rostrum and I start giving my presentation and I just about was booed off. What did I learn? Well, I learned I didn't build any alliances within the corporate structure. And I didn't really understand what they wanted. And they certainly didn't want to be held accountable. So, I was really, really, really angry. So I went home and I got a phone call. I had a friend coming up for dinner from the South Bay. And I told him what happened. The next day I get a phone call from a fellow you might know, Mike Gerber. He wrote the E-Myth and Michael was my partner. So Michael called me and recruited me. And that was my first entrepreneurial experience. Now, I started off with him as a straight commission salesman. And excuse me, that decision to leave I had a nice corporate job with a company car. The average salary in those days was $11,000 a year. I was making 16 with a company car. I was doing very well. I left it all for Zip, for zero to go with an entrepreneurial route. And the first time I did it, and I share this with your folks, with your audience, it was scary. It was scary. My wife had a fantastic job, fortunately, so we could live on one income. And the decision was so agonizing. I remember I put my head in my wife's lap and I just cried. I just lost it. Anyway, I ended up going to work with Mike and his partner Ace, and the company was called Newsmaker. And it was his idea originally, and I like to say I refined it, but a lot with his help because he was a masterful salesman and sales manager. But the concept was to create a public relations publicity company modeled after the insurance business. And that's really what made us distinguished and unique. So in the insurance business, you don't have to be an underwriter or an insurance specialist to sell insurance. You need to know how to sell the features and the benefits and the applications and so forth. It's like any other industry. You don't have to know how to build a television set to sell a television set. You have to know why people need TVs and so forth. So we created a situation where we had salesmen, we called them account executives, selling publicity, and we had writers executing and doing the writing, and we set it up like a manufacturing operation. And that was how I initially got started with Newsmaker. And within 3 months, they came to me my two partners came to me with an agreement to be in business with them. Frankly, the contract was stupid. It was all salaries, all payments to me would be advances against my tuition, if you will, the cost of the business. So essentially, I would be working for nothing. But I didn't care because I was into it. I was an entrepreneur. I was doing my thing. Well, our service in those days sold for $395. By July 4th, my wife Peggy and I had promised each other that we would come home to Boston for the bicentennial. This 1976. So I came home on July 4th. By that time, again, $395 service. We had $61,000 in sales. Not bad from zero. Again, in those days. So I came home. I was only home for a week. My wife was home for 2, but it was long enough to get refreshed. I was working my ass off. I was working from 6 a.m. until midnight and loving it. I wasn't taking time to eat. I weighed 157. I weighed 170 in the 8th grade. Okay, I was down to 157. Smoking a couple of packs of cigarettes a day. Just didn't take time. I was working my butt off. So I get home to San Francisco after my week's vacation. I call Mike up. I get a call from Mike. Mike says, "Hey, meet me at the airport tomorrow morning. We're flying down to LA doing some business." I said, "Great." So I flew down to LA with Mike and we did some business with this company they had control over and, marketing business. On the way back to San Francisco on the flight, Mike says to me, "Hey, listen, Ace and I decided we want you to start another business for us, with us." And at that point I said, "Mike, that's not what we agreed to." He said, "Well, that's what we'd like to do." So I said, "Listen, I've got to think really strongly about that." So I took a couple of days and I tendered my resignation, but I felt like I was punched in the gut. This was my love. I mean, I loved the action of Newsmaker and what we were doing. And so I was crushed, absolutely crushed. And I got a book. I said, "Listen, I want to get my life. I want to get this right this time." I got a book entitled "Where Do I Go From Here with My Life" by Nelson and Bowles. It's about a 5 or 6 week program to go through. It was an oversized paperback. You write essays, you correlate you put a lot of information together and they correlate it with you. You get a specific immediate job objective. You look at what needs to be doing in your life, your preferred people environments, what successes you had, a lot of things, what needs to be done in the world and all that sort of. So it's a really, really incredible program. So while I'm doing this, I get a call from Dennis Lone. Dennis was the creative director of Newsmaker and Cuneiform, the companies that Mike and Ace owned. And Dennis said to me, "Listen, I don't like the way you were treated. I want to leave, but you're a sales expert. Would you join me for a couple of beers and teach me how to sell?" I said, I'd be delighted to. So I drive down to Santa Clara and we meet in a bar and we go through this whole process. And I explained to him how you sell and what we did at Newsmaker. We explained what publicity was, what it could do for a company, the services we provided and what they cost. And naturally, you get affirmation entirely at every phase, because if you don't, you're going to lose your prospect. Anyway, so I explained all this to Dennis and I said, just while we're at it, I said, I was a pretty good writer in school and I got straight A's. I'd like to give me a sense of your writing formula and how that works. And he told me that. It was great. We sucked down our beers, ate the peanuts, walked out the door. And he says to me, there's a big guy, Dennis Sloan. He was like a big teddy bear. He puts his foot up in the back of a bumper of a car. He says, what do I owe you? I said, Dennis, you don't owe me anything. He says, no, what do Dennis, you don't understand. You just made me a millionaire. Now, he thought it was just a bullshit of a 26-year-old kid, right? 27-year-old. I said, seriously, you just gave me the writing formula that is I need to build this business by myself. He says, I've got to give you money. So I said, $50. He writes me a check for 50. And I regret to this day that I cashed that check. I should have taken it and framed it, because he made me a multimillionaire.
Absolutely amazing. We're speaking with Steven Stroum, talking about navigating entrepreneurial success. And you can find out more about him and everything at smstroum.com. That's the letters SM, STROUM.com, SMSTROUM.com. You're going to find out about the book, which I want to make sure we talk about. I'd like to take a little look behind the book. Is that the right way to say it? Behind the book or in the book? Well, anyways, I want to look into the book. I want it called Success and Self-Discovery. It's an interesting title. I'm curious, how did you come up with that title? And in it, you talk about the personal growth and professional success and the connection between them. I'd love to hear about that.
Well, here's the thing. I don't think you can have success without personal growth. But for me, when I came back to Boston, my wife and I, that process that I went through with where do I go from here in my life, also had a section on where would you prefer to live. And at that point, we had been married 6-7 years, wanted to raise a family. Where do you want to do it? We decided to move back home to Boston. So when I came back home, I thought, well, listen, I'm going to look for some jobs as sales manager, because I didn't quite have the guts at that point to go into business fully for myself. So I went and I interviewed a fellow in Boston at a company called American Career Planning Services for a sales manager's job. Now, I knew I could do it because I had just done it. And by the way, when we made that agreement at Newsmaker, I took a salary at that point in a company car. At that point, I had a $36,000 salary and a company car. Now, that was big back in 77. That was, multiply that by 6 and you got today's salary. So for a 27-year-old kid, that was pretty serious. So I came back and I interviewed with this fellow named Walt Cameron at American Career Planning Services. And he liked me, but he said, Steve, you just don't have the experience that I need. I said, but Walt, I've done it and I know I can do it for you. He says, I'm sorry. I love you, but I can't offer you a job. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to start my own business. I'm going to replicate what I did in San Francisco. I'm going to do it here. And if I do, may I come and call on you? He said, of course. So long story short, he became my first account. I put $300 in the bank, which again, by today's standards, maybe $1,800. $300 in the bank. I had a logo, letterhead, business card made. The company was called I did business as Sales Development Associates, because that's what we use publicity to do, develop sales. I'll explain how I renamed it to Venmark International later. You're going to love that story. So, I met with Walt. We had a little reunion. By that time, I had hired a salesman too. All of this with $300. I hired a salesman. We go into the Prudential Tower in Boston. I call on Walt. I'm giving him the presentation, and he said, "Whoa, wait a minute! I'm not General Electric. I don't have all that kind of money, so I've created this expectation." So he says, "Listen, I said, what have you, he said, I've already spent a lot on advertising. What have you spent? He said, $40,000. I said, then you can't afford not to spend another 400. And that was my close. So we left with a check for $395, went to the elevator, had to go to the restroom. I just hit the next floor down. We went to the restroom, came out of the restroom, and there was a sign on the door that said Associated Industries of Massachusetts, Directory of Manufacturers, $15.75. I went in and bought it. We went back, and the next Monday we started cold calling, and that's how it began. Oh, I took Walter's check for $395, put it in the bank, and bought a typewriter for $300. I didn't even own a typewriter, and I had never written one of these, but I knew I was going to take good care of them. 3 months later, I had written over 50 of them, and I did Walt's over for nothing. He never knew it, but I did it over again because the first time it sucked. So that's the risk. What's the risk? The worst thing that can happen, you do it over again. So that's how I got started. And what gave me the security blanket, and I think this is just incredibly, necessary for, you would ask about the title of the book. Blue Collar Entrepreneurs was the working title of the book. And after I hired a professional editor and thought about it, the key, that was a confusing title. But what knowing sales so well did for me, first of all, if you're an entrepreneur, nothing happens until you make a sale. So you really should know how to sell. But I had a sales process, and it was as comfortable to me as that academic process. And that was my security blanket. So when I started the business, I knew exactly how many phone calls I would have to make so many appointments, how many appointments to make so many sales. And that gave me comfort. And I just went to work. And then as I replicated myself, and within 9 months, I had 10 full-time people. But the reason for the title, what happened was I had extraordinary success. Second year of business, I netted over $100,000. And again, today's dollars, that's 600. Tremendous success. Within 2 years, we had 2,000 accounts. Instead of being elated, I became depressed. And so much so and I had responsibility for 12 families. I became so depressed that I needed a therapist 3 days a week, 3 times a week, just to maintain, just to break even. And what I learned, and it's distilled this a great deal. Obviously, I was in therapy for a couple of years, is being successful so early, the type of success I was enjoying. I really did it for my mother and father, especially my mother. I wasn't doing it for me. Yes, I was doing it for me, but you know what I mean. It was more her wish. She wanted me to be the all-star of our generation. So when I went through the transformation process, I really had to discover what was important to me. And because, the curse was I achieved my success very early, 29 years old, making 6 figures and taking off like a rocket ship. So I had to get into what would satisfy me. Why was I enthralled with doing all this for somebody else? And utilizing my skills and my talents to make my parents happy as opposed to making myself happy. So I learned how to make myself happy, and I went through a number of processes to refine that, and I'm glad I did. It's worked out extremely well. So that's the success in self-discovery. The self-discovery process involved that book, Where Do I Go From Here in My Life? It involved keeping journals and putting in the journal the date, the time of day, issues that I was dealing with. And then over time, you could look at all of this and see what time of day you were most productive. You could see what kinds of issues were coming up repeatedly, what was real, what was not real. Because as you know, in a situation, if you're bootstrapping a company and starting from nothing and you're undercapitalized, you're going to make mistakes. And the journals and journal entries and that sort of thing helped you really determine what was real and what was not real in terms of stresses.
We're going to take a look at some of the core lessons in your book. I have a question, but before I go into the question, I want to give a little comparison for my friends here. In 1972, I was going to school or going to school. You pick. I'm Italian, so I get silly sometimes. And I was part-time. I was making my best in 1972 was $1.65 an hour, part-time, supporting myself to school. Steve here is making 30 something thousand dollars a year and has a car. It is like outrageous, just to give you the cost comparison of what it was like back then. He may as well have been a millionaire already with the kind of income that he made. Homes were, you could buy a car for $2,000 back then, maybe $3,000 for the best sports car. So
I bought an MGB for $3,000.
Yeah, for the best sports cars. Exactly. I remember Dodge Challengers and Chargers were Super Bs, going for $3,000. It was like outrageous income when you're making $1.65 an hour. And that's after, raises. So just to give you the comparison of how fast he's taken and the importance of this, because it really hits home. And I want to go into the book and talk about some of the core points in there. And again, you can go to smstroum.com and you can get the book, because wherever you're at, whether you're at 5 or 6 or 7 digits or wherever, I am certain it's going to really help you on the road to the next digit. Let's call that the road to the next digit. But one thing I want to make sure I bring up is part of your success, Steve, is you successfully integrated family into your business, which by itself can be really tricky. And, and I would love advice for our friends, entrepreneurs, business people in the audience on bringing in family into their business and what should they consider? Because, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, I would have had a totally different answer than I have now. So I would love to learn from your experience on this.
Well, the short answer is don't do it.
Exactly.
I had, again, the business took off so fast. I was looking for somebody I could trust to hire, and I really needed it. I assumed he would work as hard as me and so forth. And so I hired my brother. Now, the mistake for your audience and for everybody else is that you don't hire that way. What you do is you create a job description and you outline exactly what you need in terms of behaviors from that individual that you need to hire. And so you have a good solid job description with performance metrics, and you hire it the way they do in large companies because it works. So it was a mistake hiring my brother. So, and it created all kinds of issues, family issues and so forth. Now, when it came time in 2007, 2008 to consider the future of the company, which was extremely profitable, I decided to hire my son. But I learned some lessons. I learned that he and I needed to sit down and spend several hours on different occasions to come up with a contract that would be an agreement of what was expected of each of us, and an exit strategy. If either one of us was not happy after a year, we could leave, and that would be the end of it. Well, with children, it's never that easy. My son and I have had an extraordinarily close relationship. I mean, when he graduated from college, the gift he wanted was a 2-week vacation with me to Key West in my sports car. We'll drive down together, top down, have a great time. This is, as a father, that was the ultimate. And we had a blast. So bringing him into the business was not without risk. But again, we mitigated the risk as much as we could. And it was, to me, worth it because he could make a fortune. And indeed, he came in August of 07. And in our services at that time, I think we're up around $3,000. In the month of November, he sold $20,000 worth of business. And we were cooking. January and February, between the two of us, we did $151,000 in business in 2 months. This is an intangible business service. You're in business. You understand what that's about. It was crazy. But then I noticed he began to get depressed and he wasn't as motivated. And it's, we ended up talking about it. We went out to lunch or dinner, and we talked about it. And he said, Dad, I don't like spending the day calling on 60-year-old men. It's not how I want to spend my time. I said, fine. Now I was tempted to say then, why the hell don't you go out and build this into a company? That wasn't him. And I didn't want to, no, he was my son. I cared more about him than I did about the business. So, August came and we separated. But prior to that, I wanted to make sure that he really knew what he was doing for his career. So I signed him up with the Rockport Institute. This is fabulous for your people. I spoke to the founder, a guy named Nick Lohr. And Nick is known as, actually, he was known as the father of business coaching. And had the good fortune of talking to Nick. And so I signed my son up for it. Mark signed up for it. And it was fundamentally what I went through with where do I go from here with my life. But it was computerized program and it was a full 8 or 10 hours. And long story short, my son was in the right field with respect to sales and the right type of sales, but in the wrong environment. So he should have been in a much more academic kind of an environment. Sure enough, long story short, he got into working in academics as a fundraiser. And now he's, senior gift officer at Bentley University. So I was able to successfully navigate the waters by caring more about him than I did about the business and doing what was really right for him. And we always talk about really doing what's right for employees, but the bottom line is we're doing you want to do what's right for the business. And that's your obligation too. But again, for me in that situation, screw the business. I was more concerned about my son and our relationship. And it's better than ever. And we go fishing in the Keys every year together. And that's one of my favorite things.
I like that. And I like the fact of learning from that. If you bring family in, get a description. Don't just say, come on in, your family. We hang out at dinners all the time. We hang out at family celebrations. We buy gifts for each other. It's a whole different mindset. Okay. It's like, bring them in. Here's your job. This is what I think this is what the company would like needs to be done. And if you can do these things, the company will grow and et cetera. And it's really setting down. And I think structure is so key on bringing in family and that expectation of, cause it's your family member. So you don't want to, give too much or be too irate or be too demanding because you can't blow that relationship. You're stuck with this person. You can pick your friends, you can pick your employees, but your families are already chosen for you. They're set.
Well, I do have to say that my wife was my best employee. She started the company with me, and she was a bright woman. She was medical assistant to this chief of staff of Mount Zion Hospital in San Francisco. So she was a very, very bright woman, and she came and very adaptable, and she was my assistant for the first couple of years. And whenever I needed to be bailed out over the years, she came in and bailed me out. I had an assistant with me for 12 years. She quit. I failed at hiring a good replacement. My wife came in, found a replacement. That woman was with me for 26 years. So my wife was much, much better at human relations and hiring people than I. And so that was very successful. And
there's a lot of truth to the statement years back. I don't know if it's a statement anymore, but years back, we always used to hear behind every successful man is a good woman. You could look it up, but it was like, there's always a woman behind the successful man. That's what helps keep that success going. Because anybody can go out and do something quickly for success, but to keep it, to sustain it, that's different.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, it's interesting too. I went through a number of changes and changed the structure of the company from a dozen people to half a dozen people. And every time I made a change to reduce the size of the company, I go home to Peggy and say, honey, I'm going to be cutting back at the business and we just might have to settle for less money. Every time, Tony, she would say to me, I don't care about the money. I just want you to be happy. Okay. Every time I did that, and there were 3 major times that I did it, I ended up making more money, believe it or not. Every time I made a shift to be happier, I ended up making more money. And that brings me to another thing that I learned about salesmen and about selling and about people. People used to say, well, just pay more commissions to your salespeople, you get more sales. Not true. Not true. And here's why it's not true. People will produce to the level at which they're comfortable socioeconomically. And here's a great example. Go to Judith Christ's Steakhouse and ask their waiters how much money they earn. Or go to Olive Garden and ask their waiters how much they earn. They're doing the same job, aren't they? But, one's earning $200 a night and another one's earning $1,400 a night. So the same holds true with sales. I had a terrific salesman that rather than continuing to propel and become super successful, he would sabotage himself because he kept himself at a certain income level where he was comfortable. Sound rational? It's not rational, but it's real.
It
And
is so true. I've run into that so many times. It's a total mindset of what that salesperson can accept. If it goes over their head or too high, they can panic.
these are the surprises that what I've tried to incorporate in my book for people who want to get into business for themselves, who are blue collar entrepreneurs. And really anybody. I've had serial entrepreneurs who were clients of mine write me letters and say that the book was, a masterpiece for any entrepreneur. Is you see these things that just don't seem rational, and you run into things in business that you just can't comprehend. And it's your ability to deal with them and learn from them and move on that is going to determine whether or not you're successful. And that's
let's jump into the book. This is a great time to talk about core lessons. And as you just mentioned, in a way, that what's the key takeaway? What can we get? We're business people. We're entrepreneurs. We want to move up to the next level. What can we learn? This interview has a lot of great information, but now to kind of summarize it a little bit as to the key takeaways, I think that would be really good to know right now.
Well, and here's a key takeaway. I'll read it if I may. My wife has a nephew. He's my nephew as well, but the kid had a tough time in his 20s. His mother and father were both addicts, and unfortunately, this happens all too often in this country, as you know. They were both drug addicts, alcohol abusers. So this kid, had a terrible background. At any rate, he ended up in California meeting a lovely woman who was also troubled background. The two of them have a couple of kids, and he's a security guard at a facility, a manufacturer marijuana growing facility. He's a security guard. So he's my nephew. We just got reacquainted. I knew him when he was 8 or 9, but lost track of him. At any rate, I sent him a book, and he wrote to me. He sent me a text. Took some advice from your book, got me another $30,000 more a year for my contract. Thanks for sending it to me. So I wrote back, freaking awesome. And I wrote, Matt, tell me specifically, please, what advice you took. I'm really happy for you. So he wrote back, learning my worth. And he said, I decided to make some preparations, went into my client's office and demanded a meeting with them. I told them you can find other security, but no one who cares and puts the passion and dedication into the job like I do.
Wow.
So he believed in himself. He became assertive. And that's just one example. So that's the sort of inspiration that I want somebody to take from the book. And also, at first I was afraid to be an entrepreneur. It's risky. You're hanging yourself out on the line. It's really scary. But it's the best course of life. I mean, people say to me, why do you still work? I still work because I love what I'm doing. I've loved it since I was 25 years old. I'm doing this. I'm working. Oh, Tony, I work with the same clients I've worked with for 47 years. These are people that I've had lunch with almost every month for 47 years. They're friends of mine. I love what I'm doing, and I've had just extraordinary experiences. And first I've done some crazy things, which you can do when you're in business for yourself. I'll give you one example. If I may, back in 1985, I remember my son was 5 years old, 84. There was a TV advertisement for Atari computer systems. I don't know if you remember it, but Atari was trying to sell computer systems they had a kid get off a train all rumpled and frumpled, and he failed college. And the message was he failed college because he didn't have a home computer, go out and buy home computers. Do you remember that?
I don't remember the ad, but I remember the home computer craze, if you want to use that, and how it started going into business. And it was like the coolest thing. You could have these things in there and information and contacts and not emails yet, but it was just like, wow, I want one. This would help me improve my job, my business.
Yeah. Well, at any rate, that advertisement got me so angry that I created a parody company called Crabapple Anti-Computer Club. Now, if you look at the logo, you'll see it had a worm with a silly grin on his face. Now, why did I do that? Well, I was, again, angry about their advertising, number one. Number two, I set up a separate corporation. I wanted to be sued by Steve Jobs. I wanted to be sued. Now, the Crabapple Computer Club had a tremendous amount of publicity. When I sent out a press release, I was in Inc. magazine, USA Today. I was on NBC News, CBS News. I was all over the country. I was getting calls from college buddies I hadn't talked to in years. And I created the Crabapple Anti-Computer Club with a newsletter. I wanted to get sued. If I got sued, what would it do to my stature as a 5-year-old publicist? I'd have come up to Steve Jobs' level. That's a great level to be at, rest his soul. Anyway, I never got sued, but it created tremendous opportunities. First of all the exposure impressed my people that worked for me. They were all proud of their boss. My banker, my accountant, clients, they all saw it in the newspapers as front page and so forth. But what it did was open up other doors. I got invited as a result of that to be a member of the Norbert Wiener Forum at Tufts University to study the impact of technology on society. I was invited to be on WJAR TV in Providence to talk about computers and childhood education. All these things. I mean, it was incredible. I had to study like hell to, quote, become the expert that I made myself out to be. But these are all the things you can do when you're an entrepreneur, and you don't know what's going to happen. But again, I looked at the downside risk. I set up a separate corporation to do it. I funded it. I would have lost some money, big deal. But I gained so much from it. And that's another lesson that I want. My old boss in California, I called him a boss because I looked up to him, but my partner, Ace Remus, Mike, there was again, Ace and Mike. Ace I'd bring a problem into him or a suggestion to him. He said, don't think about it, do it. That would be his favorite. Don't think about it, do it. So I go do it. I'd come back, I'd evaluate it, make a change, do it again. And that's how you learn. So, I'm convinced that people who don't become entrepreneurs and don't try it and don't go into business for themselves, they're more afraid of success than they are of failure. Anybody can fail. That's easy. Just don't do anything. But to succeed, when you succeed, you become accountable, because I've never met anybody who's successful. I've never met an entrepreneur that blames somebody else for something that happened to them. Hey, if my salesman screwed me, I must have made a mistake in hiring that person. You know what I'm saying? It's you hold yourself accountable first. And that's the beauty of entrepreneurship. And it makes for an exciting life. It makes for an exciting life. And one of the reasons I wrote my book, for example, it was at age 73. I looked at myself in the mirror and said, Stroum, you've been wanting to do this for 40. I made my first entry with the title Blue Collar Entrepreneur in my diary back in 1983. Okay. 40 years it took me to finally get off my ass and do it. But that's the entrepreneurial spirit, is never too late.
That's right. It never is. And that is some book. 40 years, 50 years of inspiration, motivation, and real hands-on assistance and help and workability. Really good. That was it for today. I just want to say, this is Stephen Stroum talking about navigating entrepreneurial success. Once again, that's smstroum.com, smstrom.com. Steve, great information, great topics, just goes on and on. I encourage my friends here in the audience to go check out that book and go to the site and find out more, because this is the real deal. This is what entrepreneurship and the business life is. And when you are in control of it, you may work more, but you have more fun.
It's absolutely a blast. Tony, I have to thank you for this. It's the fastest hour I've ever experienced in my life. And it's great to be with you. And I just, again, if I can help more people go out and get more from their current jobs, muster up the courage to get that raise or go in for that pay raise or try a new business, if I can help somebody do that, it's a gift.
Steve, it was great to have you on. Great that you spent the time with us and gave us this great wisdom. Just thank you so much for coming on. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for listening. And if you like this, share this with your friends. Tell them about Steve and his book and some of his stories and what he's been through and how it's helped him. And you know what? For a book, just that idea, or just sometimes just an idea or a piece of information can change your whole life. What if your whole life was changed by just reading the book and checking out? What if there was just that one piece of information? Yeah, you could figure everything out eventually. You don't want to spend 40 years doing it. So check out that book. Tell your friends what you've learned. Tell them, hey, look at this. This is great. There's gems. There's jewels in that book. So check it out. And wherever you're getting this, wherever you're seeing or hearing this, please follow the show. It helps to bring in more amazing guests to help you. This is all for you guys. All right. Let's use this and let's help you move on your journey to success. Thanks. And remember, just take action. Success awaits those who persevere and remain steadfast despite the odds. Sow good seeds, do good deeds, and I'll see you on the next episode.